Great. Welcome everybody to this really exciting opportunity for us to present Dr. Rupa Marya to you as part of our seminar series through SEML and through the Health Equity and Translational Social Science theme that Helena Hansen and I co-lead. I'm like almost jumping out of my seat because I can't wait to hear. So I will give you a brief introduction. Dr. Rupa Marya is a physician, activist, writer, mother, and a composer. She's an associate professor of medicine at UCSF and co-founder to Do No Harm Coalition. And if you read their value statement, it states that we are healers, health workers, activists, accompanying communities affected by state-sanctioned violence in our collective struggle for health, dignity, and sovereignty. Health is a human right, and as health workers, we have a collective duty to eradicate systems of oppression which threaten that right. That's the value statement from Do No Harm Coalition. Her work sits at the nexus of climate, health, and racial justice, and she is the co-author with Raj Patel of the book Inflamed, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice. She works to decolonize food and medicine in partnerships with communities in Lakota territory, at the Mini-Wachoni Health Circle, and in Ohlone territory through the Deep Medicine Circle. She's toured 29 countries with her band, Rupa and the April Fishes, whose music was described by the legend Gil Scott-Heron as liberation music, and I sampled it this morning, and it is absolutely beautiful. So with no further ado, Rupa Marya, welcome to UCLA, and the stage is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm speaking to you today from the occupied unceded territory of the Ramaytush territory, now called San Francisco, used to be called Yelamu. I'm going to share my screen with you, and we were going to talk about decolonizing medicine. So can we all see that? Are we all good? Okay, cool. So I was born and raised in these territories. I was born and raised in what is now called Mountain View. When there used to be apricot orchards before there was Google and Facebook. And I was raised here as the daughter of Punjabi immigrants who left our homelands because of the trillions of dollars that were stolen over centuries of colonization of our homes. And so as a young girl, I have been very sensitive to the presences I could feel in India and that I could intuit were here, but I didn't see it in the strip malls and the architecture of what I was seeing in the Bay Area, and didn't really start to get to learn the history until I started working directly with California Native communities. And I just want to acknowledge how much Ohlone community and other California Native people have informed my understanding. And a great artist, L. Frank Manriquez, who's Tongvan from the territory you all are sitting in. She's another great person who I count as an elder and advisor. So I just want to thank everybody for teaching me what I'm going to share with you. So the work that I've been doing is really looking at the ways in which our health and the health of the planet have both been impacted by systems that were put in place about 600 years ago. So the combination of colonialism with capitalism, this extractive economic system, together with a system that was looking to, take over people's lands and take over labor. And the systems of supremacism and domination that required, and then the end results of those systems of domination, how those sort of feed into each other and generate health or illness. And what I saw through my work in the hospital on the front line as a hospital medicine doctor, and then by touring as a musician, where often I'd go to use my band as a vehicle to go and look at places where you could see the intersection between society and health. I would go to the autonomous territories in Chiapas, where Zapatista communities were working to reclaim their food and medicines and systems and land. I would go to Greece during the economic downturn and looked at how people were starting to organize and take over systems. And what I really came to understand is that while humans have colonized each other for millennia, the toxic combination of both colonialism and capitalism that we've been living under over the last 600 years has created a crisis for the planet and for human health. And that it is being manifested through inflammatory disease in the body, in our body, and through inflammation in the planet. Literally, our planet is on fire. But this isn't simply a metaphor. If you look at what's happened to the soil under this architecture of thought, the soil is being oxidized, the soil is inflamed through industrial farming and the mindset that comes through colonial capitalism. And so what we talk about a lot in our book is that colonial capitalist cosmology and understanding how medicine is a part of that cosmology. We contrast that to other cosmologies that tend to be from traditional cultures and indigenous cultures, where there is a constant relationship to the web of life. And so we will come into that a little bit later. We can see the impact of colonialism today in COVID. So when we look at who's dying from COVID and how, we can see a disproportionate impact on people who have suffered the most under the brunt of colonial terror. So our indigenous communities, our Black and Brown Latino communities. And so what is that about, that question? So we look at the structural determinants of health, and that's something that's now become like a buzzword. And what Raj Patel and I do in our book, Inflamed, is we look at what's actually causing those structures. What are the origins of those structures, and how did those structures come to be? And those structures have been engineered through 600 years. And what we're seeing in the bodies of our patients is a direct outcome of those structures. And if we are going to treat our patients effectively, we can no longer dissect them from their histories or social contexts, because inflammatory disease, specifically the kinds we treat, which are they predispose people to worse outcomes from COVID, and severe COVID itself is another manifestation of inflammation. These are telling us something about what's happening to the body, and so we look more deeply at what's going on. When we look at the theory of epidemiologic transition, we see, back in the day, people were dying of pneumonias, people were dying of infections and pandemics. And as that receded, people started dying of more man-made diseases, or what we're calling diseases of lifestyle. So cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, strokes, cancers, and these are things that we see the way your doctor might talk about them, or you should do different things yourself to improve your health outcomes. And what we do in our book is understand that this we consider that almost like a blaming the victim, because this architecture of society that's been created through colonialism has made it impossible for most people to avoid these diseases. And if we want to start seeing different outcomes in these diseases, we have to start looking at the architectures around the bodies. So as a hospital medicine physician, these are the most common, diseases that I see and I treat. And I guess any bread and butter, internal medicine doctor, this is what we're looking at. And all of these diseases we now know have inflammation as a part of their pathogenesis. And so what we started to wonder about, especially as I was touring with my band and noticing a really abundant expression of these diseases in communities that had been suffering under the brunt of colonialism more intensely, whether they were Irish people under the first colony, which was Ireland, whether it was Irish people under British colonial rule, or people in the Dene or Navajo people in the United States, you started to see relatively greater abundance and more profound expression of these diseases with lower life spans. And so we were wondering, what is that about? What's going on in the body? And so I used to call it, when I was touring, I'm like, it's almost like there's a colonized person syndrome. If we could just understand that all these diseases are traveling together, and they called it, metabolic syndrome X, and you're just eating the wrong things, or you're not getting enough exercise, you're too sedentary, therefore you're going to get this metabolic syndrome. Or maybe it's a genetic predisposition in people in South Asia, they're all going to die, young. But when you talk to elders from these communities, especially when I was in Standing Rock, I was invited out there by California Native activists because of my work around racism and state violence. And they asked me to coordinate the medic response as the police were becoming increasingly violent against the people standing against the pipeline. And you talk to the elders there, and they will say, we never had these diseases. Before the white people came, we never had cancer, we never had diabetes, we never had high blood pressure. And as a Western medical practitioner, I can look at them and smile and think, oh yeah, you just didn't have a way to diagnose it. But of course you had those diseases. Everybody has those diseases. But when you look at the archaeological record, and you look at the bones, and you look at those things, you don't actually see evidence of those diseases. And if you look at indigenous communities that are living with their cultures intact and their web of relationships intact around them, they also do not have the burden of inflammatory disease that we have. And we'll get into what that is about in just a second. So inflammation, the inflammatory response, is an ancient evolutionarily conserved healing response of the body to damage or the threat of damage. So you can see it when you think of a paper cut. So you get a paper cut, the body mobilizes resources to stop the bleeding, and then the inflammatory response, this innate immune response, is activated to start repairing that wound. Once the wound has been repaired, the inflammatory response turns off. But if in the case of chronic inflammatory disease, those damage signals keep coming, whether it's because you're exposed to toxic air, whether it's because you're exposed to pesticides, whether it's because you're exposed to police violence in your community, the PTSD, trauma, stress, all of these things create these danger signals in the body, and the immune system is responding to it. So the inflammatory diseases that we're seeing today are not an abnormal expression of the body. They're the body's normal, evolutionarily conserved expression to a world of damage. And what we see is that the world of damage is constructed in a much more damaging way around Black, Brown, and Indigenous people compared to white folks in this racialized society. And in other societies, like in India, you'll see the same kind of architecture around caste or religion. So these systems of domination and what they create are systems of damage around the body that the body is responding to the way it's been programmed to. As I was doing research for the book, I really enjoyed reading about the history of immunology. So when we were looking at this through reading, history and histories of colonization, timed with the history of understanding in medicine, you understand that our frameworks of understanding immunology came from the same Enlightenment errors that we live with today in medicine. So when I learned immunology in the 90s or early 2000s, I learned that, the body recognized, the immune system was there to recognize self versus other. Well, that concept itself is a liberal concept that came from Cartesian dualism, as if there was a self and then there was an other. And what we see now with, even microbiome science or the neural network or the mycelial network in the soil is that there's a much more blurred sense of what is self and what is other. There's a much more complex understanding to what those things are, but we live with these remnants in our imaginings. Throughout time, the model of immunology has evolved from a self versus other recognition of self versus something foreign to what we have today, which I think is probably the most powerful explanatory model in immunology, is that the immune system is activated by danger or by damage signals. So it's not that it's foreign or not foreign, but that there are alarm signals that are set off by the body to detect danger. That can happen in the form of an environmental toxin. It can happen in the form of a pathogen. It can also happen in the form of distressed or injured cells. And these danger signals are what activating the immune response. Where this becomes important is when these danger signals don't stop, that damage, the inflammatory response, moves from a healing response into one that generates more harm through the production of its chemical mediators that create localized tissue damage or systemic inflammation. Through reading the history of fever and inflammation, I was really struck with learning about how we thought about this in Western medicine. So in the 6th century BC was the first time there was an identification of a symbol for fever, like connecting fever and inflammation. In 20 BCE, the Roman physician Celsus described inflammation as the cardinal signs with rubor, calor, dolor, and tumor, the redness, the heat, the swelling, the pain. And in the 2nd century ACE, there was this idea of humors being out of balance, and that's what created illness or inflammation or fever. And that Gallen's theory of humoral theory really persisted throughout the Middle Ages until about the 1700s, when people tried to find other ways of organizing and understanding what fever and illness was. And they would give these names to fevers that had nothing to do with the pathophysiology of what was going on. So there was an ataxic fever or a putrid fever, but it didn't really tell us anything about pathology. And then in the 1800s, a French physiologist who was really called the father of physiology. I was also struck by how many fathers there are in medicine and not so many mothers. So Broussais advances this idea that inflammation was being caused by a phenomenon located in the body, in an organ, as an irritation. And that irritation, that itis, whether it was a pericarditis or a pneumonitis, that was the site of illness. And that was truly a revolution in medical understanding at that time, because it located illness inside the body as a phenomenon with a place and a time. And it really opened the door to really advancing medical treatments that could address those itises. In the 1840s, that went further with one of my favorite doctors that I got to learn about, who was Virchow. I didn't know I'd be such a fan of a German doctor. But Virchow, who in medical school I learned was, the guy who told us about Virchow's node to detect cancers, or Virchow's triad with how blood flows, who was known for his work in pathology. He was a really deeply imaginative young physician who was commissioned to do a report on a typhus outbreak in Upper Silesia. So he went as a 27-year-old young doctor to Silesia to look at what was causing this typhus outbreak and how could they address typhus. And typhus at that time was known to be a disease that really spread amongst poor people, or people who were, refugees from civil unrest, or living in conditions that were not sanitary. And so he went to this place and he came back, and in his report, he documented that what was causing typhus was German imperialism in these places. So it was the rule of Germany in Poland and Czechia, where there was an upper class German speaking group of people, and then a second class citizenship, a lower class, the native folks in those regions who were prevented from speaking their language. They were prevented from practicing their religions. They were prevented from organizing their traditional ways of interacting with food and medicine. And so Virchow claimed that, it wasn't the typhus organism that was causing disease. It was the social conditions that allowed the body's response to be detrimental. What we do is we advance Virchow's hypothesis so that we locate the cause of disease, the causes of the diseases that we treat in modern medicine, into the spaces around the body, into the histories and the social structures in the environment, as opposed to localizing them in the body. What this does is it really opens an opportunity for patients to also understand that it isn't their fault that they got diabetes. It isn't their fault that they got cancer when they never had access to living in a life without inflammation. Studies that look at chronic inflammation show that socio and environmental factors are much more predictive of developing these diseases compared to genetic factors. So this is definitely where the science and the research has already been going. For me as a frontline doctor during this COVID pandemic, this one place where we can really see this is in malnutrition and COVID. So this was a study that came out of Europe that showed, of the people who were being admitted to the hospital with moderate and severe COVID, up to 40% of them were malnourished. And when you looked more carefully at who got moderate COVID, who they were not admitted to the ICU, and who got severe COVID going straight to the ICU, 67% of the people who were going straight to the ICU were malnourished. So malnourishment is not a genetic reality that is created by social structures that makes food inaccessible, or nourishing food inaccessible to people of color, to Black, brown, and poor people in this country. So this work of understanding how socioeconomic factors around the body are damaging the body leads to this concept that's popular in environmental health, but not something that we think of as, internal medicine doctors, this concept of the exposome. And the exposome is the sum of lifetime exposures that a body is encountering. And it includes everything from your lifestyle choices, do you smoke or not smoke, to the ecosystems that you live in. Are you living in a neighborhood with trees or no trees? Is there gun violence in your environment? To social factors such as debt, which we all carry in this country. Debt itself is an independent driver of inflammation. To whether or not we're from a group that's been marginalized or racialized, to the physical and chemical environment that we're exposed to. It also includes our histories. So when we're in the uterus of our mothers, how our mothers carry those histories and how our grandmothers and great-grandparents experience those histories is a part of our exposome. The structures of power and what we are forced to encounter in terms of, let's say, for example, police violence or ICE raids, these things are part of the exposomes. Interestingly, the stories we are told, whether the world is safe for us or not, also influences how our cells behave on our cellular level. There was a fascinating study that looked at Black men who had been told that the world is not safe because of policing, which is a very necessary thing to tell a young Black boy when there's a 1 in 1,000 lifetime risk of dying from police violence in the United States. But that story itself and understanding that the world is that unsafe has direct impact on the body through inflammatory disease, and we'll get into that mechanism shortly. And then our cosmologies, understanding who we are and our relationship to the world around us. Some cosmologies are inherently damaging. Other cosmologies are uplifting. One interesting study I found out of First Nations communities in Alberta in Canada was that First Nations groups that were continuing their culture through language and continuing their story transmission, with all other things accounted for, had lower rates of diabetes. So simply the act of knowing who you are and knowing what your relationships are and actually seeing them as valuable and valued and intact, not only prevented diabetes, but was protective against suicide, which is a major problem for First Nations communities. And suicide itself, again, is another inflammatory disease. So these eras of enlightenment came across at a time when Europe was colonizing the world. So it's much easier to steal someone's land and to blow up a mountain or, mine all the silver out of it when you take away the agency of the people, or you take away the agency of the mountain, or you don't see it as a person or an entity. So that separation of people from nature, of man from woman, of mind from body, of these things is a part of Cartesian dualism and Enlightenment eras that we are living with today. The way we are still taught medicine today has nothing to do with even where the science is, that we're sort of stuck in a rut of understanding that is a part of the colonial architecture that traveled with us. when medicine was used as a tool of colonial rule. So Western medicine, like if you think about tropical medicine, which was some of the first medicine to be developed globally, was not used to keep native people healthy in their homelands. It was used to keep Europeans healthy so they could colonize and extract wealth from those lands. And so when we understand that, we shouldn't be surprised when we see that the outcomes for Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are poor in Western medicine. That shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone when we really understand what the history of medicine has been. These lands here on what is called Turtle Island were colonized by people who brought missions, medics, and militaries. So it was those the three M's, and understanding that really for myself helps me to limit my expectations of what Western medicine can do, and also start to see the need to decolonize medicine and the need to understand where our practices are rooted in, what mindsets they're rooted in, so that we can create more space for healing in our work as physicians and healthcare workers. So when we talk about, how these things, the toxic exposome gets translated down into the cellular level, this was probably the most interesting and sort of surprising thing to me that I learned. So in all of our somatic cells, all of our replicating cells can go through this transformation in the face of damage. So the kinds of damage that a cell can experience through oxidative stress, there can be mitochondrial dysfunction, there can be epigenetic changes, DNA changes, and telomere erosion. All of these changes are changes that are mediated through damage and stress. And the toxic exposome are all of these things, whether it's PTSD or even working the night shift, these are things that impact this phenomenon on a replicating cell. And what the toxic exposome does over time is it, through repeated damage through these pathways, it pushes a cell into early senescence, into early aging. And what you get when that cell cycle is arrested in this premature way is the early senescent cell goes on to develop this phenotype, which is called the secretory associated senescence phenotype. And what that is essentially is a pro-inflammatory factory. And again, this can be any of our cells. And we're finding SASP cells in our kidneys with chronic kidney disease, in our pancreas with diabetes, in our brains with Alzheimer's, in cancer milieu. So these cells are around the body generating localized and systemic inflammation through the expression of these inflammatory mediators. So this is one way in which the body takes these social environmental phenomenon and translates it into a inflammatory experience. In the research that we did, one of the exciting things we learned about, we go into a lot in our chapter on the gut. So every book every chapter in the book, we turn into an anatomy lesson. And for every chapter, we made a connection between the body's anatomy, so the gut of the body, and the earth body, to look at how we are connecting the damage that has happened to humans as echoing the damage that has happened to our earth body. That the climate catastrophe we are facing right now is caused by the same mindset that is causing this pandemic of inflammatory disease around the world. And what we found really interesting in the gut chapter was that the microbiome, the gut microbiome, is really the first and best defense against inflammatory disease. The way these organisms, even in utero, are training our immune system and tuning our immune system to be either really inflammatory or really mellow. And what we find is that guts that have both robust and biodiverse microbiota, especially with these ancestral strains of microbes that have been with humans for eons, are guts that can train the immune system to avoid inflammatory disease. And what we see is that those guts that are most biodiverse and robust in this way belong to people who are living with indigenous cosmologies intact. They are living in relationship to the web of life in a way that hasn't been severed and interrupted through colonial rule. People who are the most inflamed and also have the least biodiverse guts on planet Earth are people who live in the United States, specifically US urban dwellers. One thing that was really interesting to me in my work at Standing Rock again was one of the women, one of the elders told me, okay, we didn't have diabetes, we didn't have these things until they dammed our river. Like that was it. It was like they dammed our river and then everyone got diabetes. And you can literally see at Standing Rock and Pine Ridge Reservation, the rates of diabetes after the 1940s just go through the roof. And part of that is the flooding of their communities with commodity foods. But another part of that was the damming of the Minnesota River or the Missouri River. Because when that river was dammed, it flooded the entire cottonwood ecosystem. And those forests near the river were the places where the Lakota, Dakota, Mandan people had gone to for 30,000 years for their relationships to food and medicine, the relationship to the buffalo as food and medicine. And so these are not, in terms of understanding, it's fascinating to see and tragic to see that the altering of these relationships of food to ecologies and people radically shifts the gut microbiota, and it happens within one generation. So the most recent example of this that we looked at was with the Irish travelers. These are people who've been nomadic in Ireland for about 1,000 years. So they were genetically Irish, but ethnically distinct people who lived a nomadic lifestyle where they lived in large families. They went around in their caravans. They lived with their horses and animals. And the Irish government forced them into settling in the 2000s, early 2000s, because they didn't want them going around and camping in people's private property. And so when you look at those people over the last 20 years, what you saw is that, in the early 2000s, the Irish travelers didn't have the inflammatory diseases that we had. They didn't have asthma. They didn't have inflammatory bowel disease. And they had these ancestral microbes in their gut microbiota. And so when they were forced into settlement, their diet didn't change. It wasn't like you just eat something better and you get, worse microbes or better microbes. Their diet actually stayed the same. What changed was their lifestyle. They were no longer in situations where they were able to live in their large family groups. They were no longer in situations where they were able to live amongst their animals, and their microbiota biodiversity fell. And they lost those ancestral strains that are the most protective against inflammatory disease, which is remarkable to think of how forced settlement or colonization or enforcing a person's, worldview on another can radically change the internal architecture of how their immune systems are working. What's also interesting about knowing that indigenous communities who are living with their cultures intact steward the greatest biodiversity inside their bodies, they're also stewarding the greatest biodiversity outside their bodies. And what is it about their worldviews and their ways of relating that we can learn from in order to better improve our health from a climate perspective and from a community and personal perspective? So for this is how we really think of decolonizing medicine. So we have to start escaping the logic of individual health and understanding that we are systems within systems. If our health depends upon the millions of organisms that live inside and outside our body, then what constitutes as me or my individual self? And how do I care for myself through caring for all those other organisms, not just inside me, but all around me? We have to understand that health is an emergent phenomenon of systems interaction and optimization, so that we cannot simply hope to have an impact by just giving people insulin and managing their blood glucose without starting to restructure the toxic exposomes around people that are driving the rising rates of diabetes. We have to understand how history and lines of power are impacting health on an individual basis, and then also at our communities at large that we're serving. The work that we must do in medicine must reintegrate people into the web of life and to the web of relationships. And that really is the work of decolonizing medicine as it is taught today, seeks to keep, or it just reinforces keeping those relationships invisible, and also doesn't translate where the science is today into clinical practice today. There's a huge lag time between what our microbiome scientists are sharing with us and what we actually apply into clinical practice. We also must dismantle systems of hierarchy within medicine. So our nursing, our herbalists, our physical therapists, all of the practitioners, our pharmacists who are part of the health ecosystem, our promotadores of health, have to be involved in the ways of knowing and knowledge and keeping that keep communities healthy without toppling the structure with physician at the top. We have to recenter the patient as the expert in their own body and in their own health, in their own ways of knowing, and the physician as the accompanist, so that our work is in following people through their journey in health as opposed to dictating what health is from a top-down model. And what Raj and I do in our book is we really talk about, while we want to abolish the logic of domination that has structured Western science and medicine, we don't want to throw away Western medicine or throw away Western science. We want to expand science to admit other forms of knowing and other systems and expand who the peer is in peer review. One of the beautiful things we were looking at in the book was the difference between ecological forest management from a Western perspective and traditional ecological management from an indigenous perspective. And we're working on this right now on a project I'll speak of shortly called Farming as Medicine, where we're blending agroecology together with traditional ecological knowledge. And what traditional ecological knowledge has in forest systems that Western medicine or Western science does not have is that it is always moral. It always has a imperative, which is to improve the health of the whole system. And that's not something we think of in medicine, when something that we really could seek to learn from, so that we stop atomizing body systems or even people or communities and start understanding the integration of these things. From a more brass tacks place, we have to abolish corporate structures, create worker-owned structures. I don't know how many healthcare workers are out there on this call, but man, California's COVID response has been governed by healthcare executives whispering into the ear of the Secretary of Health and to our governor. Those people are not the ones who have to show up in trash bags to work because we didn't have PPE. Those people are not the ones who've been exposed like I have 4 times at high-risk exposures in the hospitals because we don't have policies in place that actually protect providers and protect patients. And so that when healthcare is a worker-owned phenomenon, when nurses and providers are the ones working with patients to dictate what that looks like, we will have a different kind of healthcare system. And so that's why I am very excited. It's not the push for single payer in AB 1400 in California is an important push, but it's only the first step in really eliminating these corporate structures. We have to end capitalism. So if colonial capitalism has brought us to the point where life is becoming uninhabitable on planet Earth, and people who are brown, black, and indigenous are already starting to suffer the impacts of climate change today, we have to start radically imagining new economies. And it's great to start with healthcare and things that directly impact health, like food and shelter, education, and land and water. We have to partner as healthcare workers with frontline communities who are already developing alternative economies of care. There's a lot of exciting work that's been happening in the wake of COVID around this. And we have to start repairing harms towards groups that have been most impacted by colonialism. And I'll talk a little bit about that through the Deep Medicine Circle. So in this last year, we've been incubating this idea for about 8 years. And this last year with COVID and seeing everything, I just had to put down my stethoscope and pick up a pitchfork. I'm married to an organic farmer, and I've been working with California Native community for a long time. So we formed this new entity that we are calling the Deep Medicine Circle. And it's a worker-directed, women of color-led program that seeks to heal the wounds of colonialism through partnerships with indigenous and settlers together to heal the wounds through food, medicine, story, learning, and restoration. And so we work to care for the earth and care for the people and reframe our farming and our land stewardship work through that model. We work on 2 farms right now. This is a 38-acre farm in San Gregorio, California, that we are rematriating to indigenous community. And we are hiring young women of color farmers on this farm to steward the soil and steward the water and liberate the food from the market economy. So all the food that's grown from here is going straight to San Francisco to address the manufactured crisis of hunger in the urban centers. It's going to, we're partnering with the American Indian Cultural District, with the Friendship House, and with Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation to just give the food away. So all the food that's grown here will be grown through agroecological practices that blend traditional ecological knowledge with agroecology. We're also working on a rooftop farm in Oakland, California. So it's the largest rooftop farm in the West now. My husband, who is the guy on the right, Benjamin Farr, he designed these systems. He married a city girl who refused to move to the country with my little half-brown children. And so he started designing rooftop farm systems and now has 1 acre up in Oakland, and now 2 acres are going to go up in San Francisco. And he's put those farms under our leadership to grow food for the people. So they don't become, gentrifying entities, but they become entities that serve directly the communities that have been most impacted by the development in the cities. Here you see on the left-hand side, Greg Castro, a Ramaytush Ohlone elder. That's myself. And then Sage Lapena, who is a Namtapamwintu Pomo Pit River indigenous plant medicine woman who works at the Sacramento Indian Health Clinic and who is working with us as our TEK teacher. And she and I together are working on developing practice for a decolonizing medicine clinic together on this farm. This is us planting an oak tree back in the land. So that's one of the first California native foods. The farmers who were driving by as we were doing this must have thought we were crazy because we're planting like 3 big oak trees in the middle of a field they'd probably like to plow. But we're reintroducing the California native foods. So acorns, hazelnuts, the riparian corridor there is already filled with medicine from nettle to elderberry. And this farm is located exactly 1 mile away from where Portola landed. And where he started his brutal conquest of the peninsula. When he landed, he stayed for 4 days there because his crew got sick, and it was the California Native community who lived in this valley who went there to tend them with the food and medicine that they had access to. So what we're doing with this work is understanding that our health really begins in the soil. And through tending the soil and caring for the soil, we can care for our health. And that we're starting to explore how those interactions are happening at the level of the microbes and at the level of the food that's grown and how the food is grown in these intersections. So we were looking at what the food system is today. And this food system today is largely large-scale operations, industrial operations that are based on fossil fuel inputs. It starts with stealing land from indigenous people. There's a great damage to our soil fertility and our soil. I'll give it a picture next of me driving through Kern County on Indigenous Peoples Day. Carbon dioxide is being lost, water is being lost, the microbial biodiversity of the soil is suffering, and that impacts nutrient density, because it is when the soil is biodiverse, just like our gut, that the plants have greater immunity, and that is mediated through the fungi and the bacteria in the soil. When the soil is more biodiverse and the fungi are present, they create a sponge. They create this glycoprotein called glomalin that literally is a spongy presence that glues the soil together. And when we don't have that, when that's interrupted through the practices of extractive industrial farming, we lose our soils. And you'll see that California is turning into a dust bowl right now. You get pesticide residues in the food. We now know that those pesticide residues end up impacting the gut microbiota of people and animals. You get dietary chemicals that also impact that gut microbiota. You get the erasure of indigenous people, and the profits go to, the farmers or the big ag companies, but they don't go to the whole system. And that's what it looked like driving through Kern County last week. I was wondering how many cases of valley fever we'll see next week. But the soil is literally just blowing in the air. It's horrific, especially when you realize how many toxic chemicals are now in that aerosolized soil that's going into children's lungs. So what we did is we reimagined, we went counterclockwise because our California native folks said we had to. So counterclockwise, you start with land rematriation. You return that land to indigenous people. You farm under their leadership and following their cultural practices. You reframe farmers as ecological stewards and really as our frontline health workers, because our health starts there. Through that work, we're increasing soil biodiversity. We're increasing the glomalin in the water retention, the sponginess of the soil. We're increasing the capacity of soil to store and hold carbon dioxide. We're decreasing the amount of pollution that ends up in the air and in the soil and the water. Through the activation of the soil microbiome, you get increased nutrient density of the food. So the food that you're receiving is actually richer in phytonutrients that lower inflammation. We looked at an interesting study that showed the difference between conventionally grown strawberries and organic strawberries. Organic strawberries are denser in those phytonutrients that make strawberries such a powerful anti-inflammatory food. So the ways that we farm right now through capitalist models of extraction are turning what used to be highly anti-inflammatory foods into empty. They're no longer medicine. We're climate adapting seeds so that they can be ready for the droughts that are here right now and to the heat. And we are creating foods that are probiotic because they're grown on soil that is rich in microbiology. That food is being given away at zero barrier access. So people who are hungry, people who are malnourished get the healthiest, best food that we could possibly grow. That leads to indigenous health, farmer health, consumer health, all goodness. So this is a model that we are working with. We've now been asked by several people around the country to present this model and to adapt this model. And so our goal is that not that, you can take over, millions of acres through one conglomerate and enact this principle. The goal is that we break up these giant farms into millions of small to medium farms and enact this through hyper localized acts of reparation and care, starting with giving land back to our native communities. So I'll just read this one quote from the book. The modern individual has been made through centuries of disconnection from the world around us, from others, and even from our own bodies. While wellness trends can help us to reconnect at some level, they incorrectly focus on the power of the individual to improve their own health, whilst ignoring or worse, diffusing another power, our ability to collectively dismantle the hierarchies that cause these disconnections and consequently a large share of the illnesses we face. Decolonization is something we don't do as individual therapy. It's not something we do on our own. It's something that we must do collectively. And I'm excited to see that work happen in medicine. Thank you so much.
Wow. Absolutely phenomenal. Yeah, I can tell right now I will never forget this moment. That was so phenomenal. Thank you so much, Dr. Marya.
Thank you.
And we do have, it's overwhelming, really amazing talk. We have a little bit of time for questions if you have and comments, if people would like to just go ahead, and we can either unmute you or go ahead through the chat.
I just want to know if Peter Sellers is really on this call, because
I am so on this call big time. I wouldn't miss this for the world. Oh my God. Hello. Hello, 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 hello. Thank you. Thank you. We're all absorbing this. We're all processing, and we're putting into our classes. We're really, this is the work. This is the work. This is the work, is to connect everything. Because as soon as it's connected, it works. And until it's connected, it will not work. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you for putting the social and cultural pieces together, culture and agriculture, because culture is agriculture. It's how human beings and plants need to be cultivated together. And this is the work. So thank you so deeply. Really beautiful. So inspiring, Rupa.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Dr. Hansen has her hand raised.
First of all, I just want to second Peter Sellers, just fantastic work. And a quick comment before my question, which is I've been working with some extremely urban community groups in Black and Latinx neighborhoods that have independently from each other. I recently came from New York, so I'm seeing on the East Coast and the West Coast that urban gardening and urban farming and community gardening are things that people are gravitating to. And so it's telling, isn't it, that people are coming to these solutions and relearning the soil, urban communities that come from agricultural ancestors, like my grandparents who came from the Oklahoma area and from agricultural areas to Oakland, decades ago. So anyway, I just want to say that you're tapping into something really profound. And my question is one that I bet you get a lot. And I know that part of the answer is to read your book, but what do you say to people who say, what do I do as this little single human being? Where can I get started on what is such an enormous assessment on your part and recommendation for, earth salvage? Like, how can one tiny human who may or may not be in the health professions begin to have an impact practically?
Yeah, so one tiny human can't, but we all together can. And so if colonialism is the act of dividing and conquering us, separating us from each other, pitting white people against other people, pitting tribes against each other, disconnecting us from the earth, from our food and medicine, which have been coexistent in our cultures for thousands of years. Decolonizing is the act of reconnecting, reestablishing those relationships, rejecting their logic of domination, and starting to work together in different ways, reimagining relationships. It's culture work. So I say, find those groups in your community that are already doing that and start to work with them and just say, how can I help? What can I do? What can I do? What should I learn? It might be as simple as pulling weeds for the first few months, and then it might be something else. But I think that those acts of showing up for each other are radical, outside of the economic logic of this system. So that's what I just think about the importance of reconnecting.
Thank you. And it's equally true of healthcare workers, right? That we're told, oh, this is the corporate model and that's that. But there are other ways, as you're pointing out, to run health systems.
Michelle, would you like to share your thoughts with the group or just stay in the chat? Either way, you can read your thought too. Oh, her mic doesn't work. So she just mentioned, I've never thought of the process of decolonization as extending even to our gut microbiome. It's so cool to see so many important causes of movements, land back, environmental pollution, access to nutritious food, etc., linked together into one focused overarching mission. Well said.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see that some researchers out of Stanford are talking about, like, you can rewild your gut. We knew, and we wrote it as a joke in the book, like, as soon as we're writing this, we know that there's a capitalist out there looking at how to turn Yanomami shit into gold. And in fact, then we saw the New York Times, like, there's the guy at Stanford trying to do that. What that shows is a lack of understanding that the gut microbiome isn't there for you to take pharmaceutically. It is a living reflection of proper relationships. So if your relationship to the living world is depleted, you're going to have a microbiome that's flaccid and like the Western microbiome, gut microbiome. If you have a robust and dynamic, engaged relationship with the web of life around you, you're going to have a gut microbiome like the Yanomami. You don't have to go there and steal their poo. You can develop those relationships here. And so how do we rewild our worlds and rewild our relationships outside of what has been prescribed for us? And that's where the work, to go back to what you said, Helena, it has to be imaginative. And that's why my work as a physician has always included art, has always included social movement, because if we are not engaged with imagining what that looks like and have access to the imagining, we're not going to be able to do it. We're going to feel impotent. We're going to feel overwhelmed. We're going to feel, oh my God, this is too much. for me, when I see this, I get like thrilled. I'm excited. Oh my God, a clinic to decolonize medicine with Sage Lopena. We just can't stop being excited about the work. And so even though it's small and tiny, the ripples are huge. And so if all of us did that, if all of us made our little ripples in our little communities, even though it might seem so small, those things add up tremendously. And this is a good time to do it. And then on the other hand, I would say what one individual can do is to support frontline communities who are doing the really hard work. So Winona LaDuke in Line 3 and the pipeline protests and all those folks who are, when there are folks out there taking a stand to defund the police, you stand with them. If the communities who are being impacted by violence are saying what they need, we get behind them with our white coats and our privileges and our academics and all that, and we stand right behind them. We don't need to give data. We don't need to give data when they have their life experience. And so that's something that I really could not stress enough is the importance of mobilizing our white coat privilege, mobilizing our resources to directly stand to serve communities on their agendas, on their health agendas.
Thank you. I think we have time for Diana Winston's comment here. I love your presentation. You were talking about expanding the dominant narratives about health and healing, admission of other ways of knowing. How does this square with multiple narratives regarding vaccines?
This was a really important question. This is a heavy question. So for myself, I want to see everybody vaccinated because I know it saves lives, and I don't want to see people die who don't have to die. And when we know that the immune system is being tuned over time, over generations, to a more inflammatory response. It's kind of like, I describe it like a guitar string being tightened. And when you have a toxic exposome, it's tightened, so that it sounds out, it gets like more taut. So when something like COVID comes along, you have an overwhelming inflammatory response. So I want to see, communities who have been predisposed to that outcome protected with the vaccine. However, I know that many Native folks, especially elders, very politically active elders, don't want the vaccine. They don't want to be participating in the Western medical narrative. They don't believe in pharmaceutical approaches. I have to respect their approaches. So I think it becomes a place of dialogue and encounter with folks who are, in Oakland, where I live. There's a lot of Black and Brown community who haven't been vaccinated for, they don't want to participate with the man. So there's a lot of political discussion and education. I think it's really important to hold space for people's narratives, to hear them, to listen, and then to just offer other narratives that might be helpful or beneficial to their path of understanding of what to do.
Great. Thank you so much. We are at our hour. Dr. Marya, thank you for being a part of our community here and for your wisdom. This was just phenomenal. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody. All right. I'll see you later.
Bye-bye.